Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Welcome back to the Think Factory podcast, powered by OGC Solutions. I'm Chris Santomassimo, your host today. I'm really excited to sit down today with Kevin Heslin and Ian Heslin, who are the president and the vice president at Seaway Printing in Wisconsin. So welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. And as we were kind of joking about, we tried this actually on site at your facility a month or two ago. And thanks to user error on my part, we're here doing it remotely again. But thanks a lot for being so flexible, too. Well, the good news about that visit at the plant that I got to see was just an amazing, amazing facility. I mean, you're talking about a lot of spit and polish, brand new facility, fantastic equipment, just the way you have it set up for purposes of all the processes that you've implemented, the technology. So that'll be sort of a nice introduction to some of the things I'd love to highlight today about your operation. But suffice it to say, as anybody who reads some of the trade publications in print, you've been celebrated, frankly, for all that hard work and investment that you made. And Heidelberg, one of the suppliers to your company, calls you one of the most productive printers in the world. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to, introduce the company and the background, what you folks do, to some folks that may not be familiar with it. You're concentrated, just to start it off, you've concentrated in the book manufacturing business. Yeah, but take it away and talk about, some of the things that you've done in your history at the company. And also we'll get into what it's like to work in a father and son duo with you two.
Sounds good. We're closing in on 30 years of Kevin and Lynn owning the business. Probably about 10 years ago that we really started focusing on book manufacturing. As we talk about it today, we joke that if it's not bound product, we don't want to do it. Both for our sake and for our customers' sake. So really, we've focused in on direct mail magazines and perfect bound books for both the professional and educational markets. And we feel that by, really picking one centered focus, we can really optimize our shop floor for that. And then also, our team to focus on producing the best product in that market for the demands that our customers have, both, turn time and price.
Well, I think you're really smart to be thinking about niching down. A lot of operators, not just in print, but beyond that, sometimes they try to do too much, and maybe they're just mediocre at a lot of things and not really hyper focused like you were.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we realized a number of years ago, and why we decided to kind of change our focus to this one niche area. Is it's really hard to be everything to everyone, and focusing on one centered market allowed us to get really good at that market and be able to hunt down and retain customers in that space instead of constantly trying to go out and sell jobs and across a diverse group of customers and product types.
Yeah, sometimes folks don't realize that the inefficiencies that come from trying to do too many different things really are detrimental to the business. But as I've seen, you've really done a fantastic job to really get smart about it, and in particular to make some significant investment in the business. Maybe you could talk about some of the technology and some of the recent equipment investments that you've made and how that's impacted, not only productivity, but also customer service and efficiency.
Yeah, by being highly specialized like we are, we're able to work, the equipment harder, more hours per day, which lets us invest in some cases, very expensive equipment. We've always kind of focused on the cost to deliver, whether it's 1,000 sheets, 1,000 folded sieves, 1,000 books to the floor. But the key in running new assets, highly automated assets, is you've got to have volume to run across them. So We just installed a new press. I say just, it's been almost 18 months now that it's been on our floor. But the press was designed to be run by one operator. Our target's 100,000 feet a shift and a 3,000 run length average. And we're hitting those numbers. So we're hitting 100,000 feet. We're doing it with relatively new operators, and we're producing a very consistent product. It's kind of amazing when we look at what comes off that machine and how consistent it is. But the machine's highly automated. So it's a Heidelberg XL106 8-color perfector. We have a plate unit on it. So we're bringing plates to the printing units from a plate cart. We cut star. So we're sheeting rolls on the press. We have the first installation in the world of a Conti web splicer in front of a cut star. So we're able to change from roll to roll without any operator intervention. And then the press also, we have impress control. So we're measuring color and register in the press. We have logistics in the delivery. So finished loads get pulled out automatically. Next pallets put in place. Press just keeps running through that. So a lot of technology went into this press, but what it's allowed us to do is create a press that one operator can run. And the key is they don't need to be at one place at one point in time to attend to something. Everything's automated. And it really lets the operator concentrate on running the machine. So, as a true machine as opposed to doing all these various tasks. And then similar to, that, when we look at folding, we've got 3 of Heidelberg's high-performance folders with their P-stacker, robotic down stacker. So again, the robot's doing all the heavy lifting for the operator. The operator is able to focus on running the machine. And again, those machines are running in line with the presses from a speed perspective, 100,000, 110,000 feet on a shift with one operator. But without the specialization, none of this, is possible, because if you're not going to run the asset hard every day, you can't, afford to make that investment.
Yeah. And how many operators would a press like that have taken to run it in a shift without all that automation and all the add-ons?
We were running 2 operators or operator and a helper, but 2 staff on the press. So it's a 50% reduction in head count, but it's also an easier press to run, which is really kind of key here. Is as we've done things, we're very conscious of the fact that we don't want to reduce head count and at the expense of burning out people and making the work difficult and miserable. So we've taken an operator away from the mix. They're actually working less than they might have been on our 6-year-old press with 2 people because of all the things they have to do.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of running around that happens. As running, I'm using that figuratively, but having to be all around the press and doing a lot of things that you're getting your hands dirty. Meanwhile, in this newer environment, the machine's doing all the work itself, just about.
It's doing much of the work. It's doing a lot of the analysis, in terms of like managing color. Basically, it's hands off for the operators and let the press do its thing. And it's going to do it better than the operator can, as long as we've set everything in place. So, make sure that the machine's properly baselined and controlled, and we have process controls in place.
Well, one thing I thought was amazing as I visited your facility was the plate changeover being automated as well. That was just amazing to watch, frankly.
Yes, it is quite the thing. It's we had been introduced to that 4 or 5 years ago when it was still an R&D concept with Heidelberg. And I remember thinking, it sure seems neat, but I don't know how it fits in our business, other than it's really cool. And then Ian and I were in Germany a year and a half ago on a trip with Heidelberg. I always joke that when I go on one of these trips with Heidelberg, it always costs me money in the end, because we see stuff that we understand how it works, and now we can justify the investment. So that on that trip, the press has already been spec'd and ordered, hadn't been released to manufacturing yet, and we ended up adding some things to the press as a result of that trip. And the plate to unit, that automated plate hanging, was part of it, and it was a big part of getting down to one operator, because that's a big thing. For us, we're running typically 4 forms an hour. So there's a lot of up and down in the press, bringing plates to the press and hanging, putting them in the slots so that they're ready to be hung, and then taking the old ones away, and all of that is gone.
Yeah, it just reduces your changeover time dramatically. I think you told me about 90 seconds.
Yeah. So
that
that
goes a long way to keeping that press running.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and I think, what I think is really creative on your part as well is that you've really solved for one of the biggest complaints in your industry, which is reliance on, an aging workforce and or people that don't have the experience being pressmen. This makes it a lot easier to get the experience that you need. And frankly, as you said, if you could reduce the number of operators from 2 to 1, that other operator can do something else, work on another press, for example.
Yeah, it's really exactly what we're seeing. I think part of it's having newer equipment, makes the workplace much more appealing to, the younger people in the workforce. Something that we've been able to do without even really making a point of it or putting much effort in is we've been able to have a workforce that's consistently younger than other printers that we know. We've really avoided some of the issues that others in the industry are seeing where, within the next 5 to 10 years, they're looking at, majority of their workforce retiring. That's something that we've just naturally, with the newer equipment, been able to kind of avoid. We've been able to find new people that see the equipment. They kind of, like working on newer stuff. They like seeing the computers driving things. It's not all, heavy mechanical machines that are twice as old as they are. And so you've been able to retain people. And then, we're just seeing that, staying on the leading edge is, part of how we differentiate ourselves when we go to market as well. That new equipment, gives us the efficiencies, gives us, quicker changeover times, all that type of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the equipment, payoff time, so to speak, in terms of productivity is a lot sooner than it otherwise would be. And, with all these robotics and all the add-ons that you've put in place, have you seen sort of an improvement in the energy and the attitude of your workforce, and the reduction maybe in some of the safety issues that you otherwise see?
Yeah, especially when we look at somewhere like folding where we have automated downpiling. We did the math, and it's hundreds to, I think, even over 1,000 pounds that employees are moving in paper during a shift. Taking bundles of 50 to 100 signatures and putting them on pallets for 8 hours. And so, just by kind of automating that, obviously there's benefits in production, but there's also the benefits of, taking a lot of that burden off your employees. You're not wearing them out as quick. The days don't seem quite as long because, they're not quite as worn out physically. So it's definitely something that we've, noticed, and, part of why we're motivated to, find some more downpiling solutions around the plant.
And besides, those, add-ons, which you might say are, just tweaks, if you will, what else do you see, coming to Seaway Printing in the next year or 2 or 3 when it comes to technology and improvements of the equipment that you use?
I think for us, some of the other targets are kind of more on the software automation end. One thing that, some of the AI stuff that's coming out, and, just even working with some companies that specialize in integrations is, how do I simplify the front end of the business as much as possible? Right now, we feel that on the shop floor, from a capacity standpoint and from an automation standpoint, we're in a spot that we're maybe happy with. We're hoping to do more, but we see tons of potential on the front end, just making, front office staff's lives easier, and then really trying to simplify work as much as possible before it gets to the shop floor. How do I make sure that there's no confusion around what needs to get done when jobs are on the shop floor in front of our staff out there?
Well, and some of that data that you take off the shop floor in terms of jobs being started and completed, how does that filter back into your your financial system, your billing system as well in an automated way?
It does not, as much as we'd like to. That's a project we're currently having, on the board right now, trying to understand how do we gather that data in a, easier and make it more accessible. One of the challenges, that we have is, we have multiple manufacturers on the floor. Each manufacturer has their own way of doing it, and then we end up with all these different sets of data that. How do we pull it all together and look at it? We're working with Co, company that is billing themselves as the MIS backbone or data backbone for our printing company, to try to understand, try to pull that data together. So rather than looking at Heidelberg's data in Heidelberg's customer portal and the Wheeler Martini data in Empower, pull it all together so we have one place to look at it, one set of analysis tools, and then give us that ability to look at the actuals, compare them to the plan, but really start to understand when we have variances, why do we have variances? And with the Co data model, we can start to look with their analysis tools without having, so a lot of the framework been built already for us, that we can start to understand that when this type of paper runs on this type of job or this type of folding scheme, this is what we see. We see better than planned performance. We see worse than planned performance. And it helps us really understand, where are the opportunities in the business? Do we want to find more work that looks like that? Or do we want to understand what this issue is that we're seeing, and how do we fix it, or how do we price accordingly for it? So that's a project we got going right now. Hopefully we'll start to see some, be able to start to understand what we can see within the next quarter or so.
Yeah, without that data analysis, you're really throwing a dart at the board and maybe looking at best for an average or a median. Here, you're able to drill down into a much finer place to understand, what's working and what's not. That's really impressive.
Yeah. As I say, time will tell how successful we are.
Well, look, as I said, if there's any indication from what I've seen, you're well on your way to, or you're already successful, but you're well on your way to staying that way. What I was about to say is that equally impressive is you two being a father and son duo. So a little bit of sharing about, about how that works, and, how you've been able to, teach Ian the business, or Ian to learn the business, and, how do you stay in your roles, and, which are a new set of roles. Yet the father and son thing you've already done, but how do you work together, and how does it all play on a daily basis?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Ian, was not planning on coming into the business originally. And when he was a senior in college, we had asked both of our kids. I have a daughter who's 5 years older than Ian. What their interest in the business was. We were kind of at a crossroads, trying to decide, were we going to, slow down growth, manage the business, and find an exit plan, or were the kids interested in the business? And we told him that, let's go off, think about this. I don't want to answer now. And Ian came back a couple months later and said he was very much interested in the business. And so at that point, we were thinking, okay, and how do we teach him the business? What parts of the business does he need to learn? Because it's a different place than, where we were when my wife and I bought the business 30 years ago. It's a very different business. Back then it was mom and pop. And what we discovered was Ian knew a whole lot more about the business than any of us knew, including him. And as he jokes, he learned about it over the dinner table.
Mm-hmm. Whether he wanted to or not, right?
Exactly. I think at that point he didn't want to, but
turned out it was good stuff to learn. I used it eventually.
There you go.
It's been funny. Really refreshing working with Ian. He's done a great job. Continues to learn, and interests are a little bit different than mine, which is good. Big data, is a part of Ian's background, and he continues to challenge me every day.
Nice. Hopefully he's nice about it when he does it, though, right?
Most of the time.
Well, that's the trap sometimes. Family members fall into this, back into their comfort zone where they, give each other a difficult time. But you guys seem to be, capitalizing on your individual strengths in a good way. When you talk about the big data background, Ian, as I recall our conversation, you've got that tech and big data background, but it wasn't really focused on print and manufacturing. Am I right about that?
Yeah, my college degree is actually in what they called interdisciplinary bioinformatics. And it was a mix of biology and computer science and kind of big data applied to your genome. So, as the Human Genome Project learned, it's really hard to figure out what's going on in your DNA by hand. It took them, I think, better part of 10 years or so to do it. And with the help of computers, it's stuff that I was doing overnight in my dorm room as I was sleeping. Mm-hmm. So it was all about, how do you process data efficiently, and then, turning around and how do you visualize it, and how do you communicate what you discovered to people? And, especially that data communication side is, key to our business nowadays. As with anyone, we have access to more data than ever, but if you can't use the data, it's useless, and sometimes even worse than useless, right? Because now it's just taking up space, or it's confusing, or whatever it might be. So it's all about, how do you get data out in front of people and communicate effectively, the message you're trying to tell with it.
Yeah, would you say that the data that you deal with at Seaway, would that be as complicated, less complicated than what you dealt with in the in your college study?
I think the data itself, it isn't very complicated. The complicated part is tying all the data together. Kind of as Kevin had hit on earlier, every vendor comes to you with their own solution for how they're going to handle their data, but they really don't offer up any solutions about how they're going to handle or integrate with other people's data. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes the headache is, how am I going to tie all these different data sources together and kind of make sure they all are communicating in the same language or trying to communicate the same way. And, that's kind of been the challenge.
Do you think about it in a linear way, according to the manufacturing process, or is it some way that you're able to bring it together in one big set and visualize it there?
It kind of depends on the areas that we're talking about. As we talk about, the sales process, which is one spot that we focused a lot on lately, we try to communicate, both, on the booking side and the invoice side, kind of, parallel to each other. So, we're tracking, on a day by day or month to day basis, what am I booking for that day, and then what have I invoiced for that day? And, we know that, it takes time for stuff to travel through our shop, but our average job is in and out the door in less than a week. And so, I can't have a super long timeline on, when I book something to when it ships. So we really need to be looking at things throughout the month constantly and watching, are we staying far enough ahead on the booking side, and then are we getting stuff out the door quick enough? And it's, all within a week that we're seeing these things, move through the plant typically. So, it's not like I can look at bookings for this month and know what's going to happen 2 months from now. It's all about, booking for this month to make sure this month hits the targets that I want to hit.
Mm-hmm. And what's your thoughts about sharing that kind of data with your workforce? Is that something? Are you pretty open about all of those performance indicators and the actual data, or is it something that maybe you're only sharing a piece of it with them?
So we do a company newsletter every month, and in that newsletter we share, our sales for the month, what our target was for the month, and then what that month last year looked like. And so that kind of allows our employees to just kind of understand, how the business is doing, at a high level. We find that, there's probably diminishing returns to really get into the weeds with employees on what's going on. But one thing that we kind of use is, we have daily targets for every machine. And if employees are consistently hitting the daily targets for their machine, then everything should be fine, in terms of getting jobs out on time and, hitting the customer requirements. And so kind of one metric that we do talk to the employees a lot about is, are you hitting your targets? And if you're not, what can we do to help, or what is, causing those issues? And, if areas are consistently off target, they kind of know that that's, becoming one of the bottlenecks for why, stuff isn't getting out the back door.
And this is all, so the operators are maintaining this information themselves. So every work center has a visual board where they are maintaining an hour by hour time card, if you will. So for every hour, they know what their target is. They know where they should be during, as it progresses through the shift. They are recording their actual production, and then the delta. So, and delta, are they ahead or behind? If they're behind, it's recorded in red. If they're ahead, it's recorded in green. So they have that information, at their fingertips as their shift progresses. Really, it's hard to hold anybody accountable if they don't have the data. And, most people, we find they got a competitive nature in them, and they want to know, and they want to do better. We had a situation, so folding was the first area we looked at because it was the area that was the biggest bottleneck at that point. We took folding from an average of 30 to 35,000 sheets a shift up into the 80,000 sheet a shift range in, maybe 5-6 weeks, by really pointing the light at it and looking at it. Folding is now typically 110, 120,000 sheets in a shift. So 8 hours, 24 by 35 inch press sheets typically, folding 16 by 8 SIGs in that section. So, really high performance. And we had one of the operators had hit a new record for the cell, and within a couple of days, one of the other operators beat it. And it was like, here's the target. Well, I'm after that. So there is this gamemanship and competition that goes on the floor around this.
Yeah, some businesses might worry that it creates stress on the operators, but in your experience, it sounds like it gets them excited in a good way.
Well, the goal was to create achievable targets. We didn't want to create a target that couldn't be met, and that's where the stress comes from, right? If we give them a target that there's no way they're getting to, then it's all just a wasted effort. But we spent a bunch of time. We looked at it. We broke it down for them and said, to hit this target, this is what you got to do. You got to run, this many minutes out of every hour at this pace, and the target's there. So everybody understood how to get there. It was reasonable. It was, we weren't asking them, to run a 4-minute mile because somebody else had run a 4-minute mile.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you do that, it changes it, right? And it's not as stressful. Now we all know there's bad days and there's good days, and a lot of times bad days are not really the operators. The operator is experienced in it, but there's been some sort of outside influence on it. It might be a machine problem, might be a particular type of stock that's not going to run that way, and those are all things that are talked about. We understand, and it's our job as leaders to get involved and figure it out and fix the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really empowering when you're managing to the data and sharing it that way, and then being there to really not push the people in a penal way, but rather to help them relieve the bottlenecks and hit those goals. I think that's really impressive. Without that data, you would make a lot of assumptions that probably wouldn't be right. So
yeah,
nice job.
And even if they were reasonable, without the data to back it up, the people don't see it as being reasonable, right? And so the data's key. Without data, Deming said, without data, you're just another man with an opinion.
Right. And again, when Well, we're getting sort of the end of our episode, but one thing I'd ask you, and maybe this is to both of you, what do you suggest, or what are some of the learnings that you've had about managing this generational transition from one to the next? Again, because you've been successful at it.
Yeah,
And this is
I
where
think
the awkward silence happens.
right. I think for us, it's just been, so key that, Kevin especially, but, Lynn as well, they've just been so open about, kind of where they're at and, getting me up to speed, right? Understanding that in order to get to where they want to go, and part of that's, retirement or other hobbies or whatever it might be, it's not just, me getting there on my own, but, how are they going to help, make sure that, I'm up to speed, and then also the organization around me is kind of where it needs to be. I think Kevin kind of hit on it earlier when we talked about it, but the business is not where it is, today where it used to be when they bought the business. And I think when they stepped in, a smaller business, it's easy to kind of wear all the different hats that are typical of a entrepreneur in a small business. But as the business continues to grow, it gets harder and harder to wear those hats, especially when it becomes inherited and not something that slowly grew over, a couple of decades. And so, understanding, the support that needs to be there. And it's not just, here's everything that was on my plate and off to the races. It's, here's the few things on my plate that need to get handed off, and here's the people I developed to do that. And then, here are the things that, you need to handle now, and kind of, understanding what that looks like, I think has really been key for us.
Ian, hit a bunch of nails on the head there. It's been a challenge for me to really understand, okay, so of these 18 things that are on my plate, which ones, can I expect Ian to take over? Which ones need to go elsewhere? My skill set's different than Ian's skill set. Ian's got skills I don't have. I have skills he doesn't have, right? So this is a case where we need to restructure the job description to fit the person. Normally that's, you talk to HR people and they say you shouldn't be doing that because, now you're starting to, create these challenges in terms of replacing people down the road. But for us, as a leader of the business, it's important that we make sure that we create that job description that plays off our strengths and protects our weaknesses, whatever they may be. And so how Ian's going to run the business is going to be different than how I ran the business. I have every confidence that it's going to be a much better experience for him and our people than it was than I brought to the table. But it's definitely a challenge. It's it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, that's for sure, especially a complex operation like yours. But I think what's coming out of this conversation to me is that things are different from how they were 30 years ago when you bought the business, in the sense that it's no longer a badge of courage, I don't think, to be able to be that person that runs around and is able to do every single job in the plant, or else you're not successful. What you're doing is you're creating systems that allow you to be a little bit more compartmentalized and focus on the high value stuff that you can bring to the table. And again, it goes back to that technology platform and the investment that you've made.
Yeah, and the company's, I kind of alluded to earlier, it's a much different company. When we bought the company, it was about $1 million in sales, and it was kind of, you categorize it as general commercial, and that might have been being nice to it. And today we're $27 million in sales. Highly specialized, highly automated, very different business. The only thing that's common between the two is that we still put ink on paper.
Right.
And as a result of that, you had different skill sets are required, different challenges, different opportunities. And as Ian kind of pointed out, when I grew up in the business, I drove this business, I created this thing, right? So it's easier for me to understand it than They're trying to think that Ian's going to understand all the components, right? And does he need to? It's
well, if understanding it brings some visibility to the table, then it's probably worth knowing about. But again, maybe it doesn't make sense to be the one who pushes the button or loads the machine, but rather to understand where that component fits into the mix is maybe the important part.
Absolutely. When Ian decided to come into business and is thinking about it, is thinking, the most important thing for me to teach Ian is how we make money and how we lose money.
And that comes with experience. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Good deal. Well, guys, this is a great, we had the benefit of doing this twice, but this was a fantastic look at Seaway and all of the great things that you're doing. Just tell people where they can reach the two of you, maybe on the web with your website.
Yeah, through our website, seawayprinting.com, and then, we really are active on LinkedIn. So we do a lot of our marketing through LinkedIn, and we'd love for people to connect with us there.
Fantastic. Well, guys, thank you again for being so generous with your time. Just as a refresher, this has been Kevin Heslin, the president, and Ian Heslin, the vice president at Seaway Printing in Wisconsin. And this has been Chris Santomassimo, the host of the Think Factory podcast. And we'll see you next time.